Before we get to examples 2 and 3, I want to introduce the topic of protocols. Protocols describe the ones and zeros going down wires or going through the air. And basically the protocol is determining what they mean. You've heard of TCP, you've heard of IP, maybe you've heard of ARP. And if we scroll down, you can see here some ones and zeros. This is when nothing's going on in the wire. So you'd have to detect these patterns in the wire. And now we're getting into some of the framing. Framing's a word of a group of bits and what they mean. So the C field format, you can see some of the bits being mentioned: negative acknowledge, positive acknowledge, retransmit, please. Some more. So you get an idea that what we're doing here in examples 2 and 3 is something related to the real world. Okay, so here we have a series of ones and zeros coming in, and it's obviously being copied several places. The goal of this particular circuit is just to recognize a particular pattern, and then when it does, spit out a 1. Otherwise, spit out zeros. So most of the time, Z is spitting out zeros, and when it recognizes a pattern, it spits out 1. The clock here is to clock the flip-flops. The word problem. Look for 2 zeros, then look at the next 3. If any of the 3 is a 1, output a 1 at the same time as the... When they're talking about timing, that means Mealy. All right, look for 2. There's 1, no. There's 1, there's 2. Okay, so there's a 2. And then look at the next 3. 1, no. There's another 2. So then look at the next 3. There's another 2. And look at the next 3. There's another 2. And look at the next 3. Okay, so we have a group of 3. And one of them is a 1. So if any of the 3 is a 1, so there could be 1, 1, 2 1s, or 3 1s. All right. That's why we output a 1. Okay, we have 1, 1 right here. So we output a 1. We have 0 1s, so we output a 0, right? We just continue on. And here we have 2 1s, so we output a 1. All right. Now we're ready for the state diagram right here. Start by telling yourself a story. Just make up a narrative. Use words and be able to do it so it flows, so it's clear in your mind. Once you can do that, then you can start drawing the state diagram. So let's start off. First step is to look for 2 zeros. So I'm going to do that in a purple pen. Right, I'm going to start right here. So let's see. No zeros. And then I'm going to try to find 1 0. And then I'm going to go to the state where I found 2 zeros. Okay, if I find a 0, I go to here. And I output a 0, because this is Mealy. If I find a 1, I stay here. And I output a 0. All right, so I've dealt with everything possible here. I can receive a 0 or a 1. Okay, here. If I receive a 0, I'm going to go to here. Output a 0. If I receive a 1, I'm going to go back to here. Well, I'm going to receive a 1 and output a 0. So now I'm here. All the possibilities. If I receive a 0 or a 1, it doesn't matter. Okay, so now it's time to switch pen colors, because I'm branching off into this section where I look at 3 in total. So there's 2 possible paths. One is no 1s yet. That's going to be up here. No 1s yet. And then another possible path is going to be here. Found a 1. If we get a 0, we're going to go up here and output a 0. If we got a 1, we're going to output a 0 and go to here. So this is the found, we found 1 now. one digit, 1 out of the 3. Okay. Now, if we find a 0, we're going to output a 0 here and go to 2. If we find a 1 here, it still doesn't matter. We output a 0. Now, if we find a 1 here, no, if we find a 1, we haven't dealt with finding a 1 here. So if we find a 1 here, we're going to go to here. 1 and still output a 0. Let's see, if we find a 1 here, a 0 here, we're just going to go all the way back and start over again. 0, output a 0. That's this situation right here. Okay, so for here, we've dealt with a 1. What happens if we get a 0? Well, it doesn't matter. We're still going to stay here, so 0, 0. What if we're here and we get a 1? Well, we're going to go all the way back, but that 1 then triggers a 1 as our output. So there's our first output. Okay, let's deal with here. If we get a 0 or a 1, we're going to go all the way back. Draw it like this. And if we get a 0, we're going to output a 1 and go all the way back, or a 1, we're going to go all the way back and output a 1. So looking at the whole thing, it looks like we go 1, 2, 3, branch off into 2 groups of 2, and then work our way back. Let's see what they did. 1, 2, 3, branch off into 2 groups of 2, and we've got this asymmetry right here. Yeah. Now, if you look at them, they have a lot of words describing each of these states. Okay, so we've got to draw a state table. Now, we're at the state diagram, right? We've finished our state diagram. We've got to draw a state table. So let's go over here and start. So this is our current state. Current state. Let's just use their symbols. So they have states of A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And then they have a possible input of a 0 or a 1. So if we're at A and we get a 1, we stay at state A. If we get a 0, we go to state B. If we're at B and we get a 1, we go back to A. Otherwise, we go to C. If we're at C and we get a 0, we go to F. If we're at state C and we get a 1, we go to D. If we're at D and we get a 0 or a 1, we go to E. If we're at E and we get a 0 or 1, we go back to A. If we're at F and we get a 1, we go to E. If we're at F and we get a 0, we go to G. And if we're at G, doesn't matter what we get, we go back to A. All right, now we're going to do our outputs. Well, everything's a 0 for a long time. Wait, this one is a 1. All right. Now if we're at F, it's 0, 0. And then G, both of them. Oh no, both of these from E are a 1. And then from G, just this one is the 1. All right. All right, let's go look at the state table they came up with. Right, 1, 1, 0, 1, AA, AA, GE. Okay, so we're done. Okay, example 3 of 3. Let's look at this. We're going to find a group of 0, 1, 1, 0 and output a 1. So here we got an example. We found a group of 0, 1, 1, 0 and we output a 1 immediately. So that's Mealy. And we find a 0, 1, 0, 0, 1. So the opposite, and we output a 1 immediately. And here's the complicated part. we find a 0, 1, 1, 0, and we output a 1. We output a 1 right here because we found a 1, 0, 0. 0, 1, 1, 0, and we output a 1 right here. 1, 0, 0, 1, and we output a 1 right here. There was 1 right here. So we had a blue, then a black, then a purple, then a red. They're all overlapping each other. So we've got to somehow build a state diagram that captures this. Okay, drawing the state diagram. So we're going to start off here, and we're going to assume we get this row first. So we're going to get a 0, output a 0, and go to this place where we found a 0. It's that 0 right there. And then we're going to receive a 1, output a 0. That's this 1 right there. So we found a total of a 0, 1, and we're going to receive that 1, 1/0. And so we found a 0, 1, 1. So I'm going to stop there. I'll explore this other branch. All right, we found a 1 and a 0, so we found a 1. And we've got a 0/0, so we found a 1, 0. That's this 0 right here. One, 0, 0. Okay, so now what we're going to do is figure out what happens if we get a 0 here. Well, if we get a 0 here, we don't value a 0, 0 anywhere. So if we get a 0 here, all we can do is value that 0. So we're just going to say stay here, 0/0 if you get a 0. Now here, if we get a 1, we don't value a 1, 1 anywhere. So we're just going to stay here if we get a 1. See, here we're valuing a 0, 1, 1. Here we're valuing a 1, 0, 0. Not the double 1, 1 or the double 0, 0. Now what happens if we get a 0 here? 0, 1, 0. Well, we value a 1, 0, so we need to go across here if we get a 0. And if we're here and we get a 1, we value a 0, 1. So let's go back here if we get a 1/0. So we're done with these two. Now let's focus on the bottom one right here. If we get a 0, that 0 right there, we want to output a 1. But we have a 1, 0. We can go back up here. So we get a 0. We don't have a 1, 1, 0 anywhere. Up here, if we get a 0 and output a 1. And if we're here and we get a 1, then we have a 0, 1. We don't value a 0, 0, 1 anywhere, but we do value a 0, 1. So let's go up here. If we get a 1 and output a 1. Now, what happens if we get a 1 right here? Do we value a 1, 1, 1? No. Do we value a 1, 1? No. Do we value a 1? Yes, we value a 1 right up here. So we're going to go up here if we get a 1 and output a 0. Now if we get a 0 here, do we value a 0, 0, 0? No. Do we value a 0, 0? No. Do we value a 0? Yes, right there. So we can go up here if we have a 0. All right, let's check. 0, 0, 1, 0. So it's the same sides. 0, 1, 1, 0. Yeah. Outputs at this low diagonal. Back here. Yeah. Very much the same. All right. Looks like they're describing these states with English rather than trying to scribble this information inside the circles. We're ready for the next step. The current state of A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And then I have my inputs. Could be a 0 or a 1. And then I need to do this for the outputs too. This is the output column. Given that our input's a 1, 0, or a 1. All right, so if we're at A and we get a 0, we go to B. And if we're A and we get a 1, we go to C. And we output a 0 both times. All right, now if we're at B and we get a 0, we stay at B. And if we get a 1, we go to D. And we output a 0 both times. If we're at C and we get a 1, we stay at C. But if we get a 0, we go down to E. And we output a 0 both times. If we're at D and we get a 1, we go down to F. If we're at D and we get a 0, we go over to E. And we output a 0 both times. If we're at E and we get a 0, we go down to G. If we're at E and we get a 1, we go over to D. And we output a 0 both times. If we're at F and we get a 0, we go to E and we output a 1. If we're at F and we get a 1, we output a 0 and we go to C. If we're at G and we get a 1, we go to D and we output a 1. For G and we get a 0, we go to B and we output a 0. All right, now let's scroll and check. Oh yeah. All right, so the last 4 states are E, F, G, D, E, C, B, D. E, F. They're backwards. G, D, E, C, B, D. All right. B, C, B, D, E, C. So the only one that looks different is this state D. So let's check state D right here. All right. So we're checking D. If we're at D and we get a 0, we go to state E. Oh, I got them backwards. If we're at D and we get a 0, we go to state E. And if we're at D and we get a 1, we go down here to F. All right, so I just had them backwards. Now let's check. Yeah, E and F. All right, we're done. Okay, let's look at this more problem. Let's look at our inputs here. Let's call our total accumulated input even, odd. Even, odd. Odd, even, odd, odd. So this bit triggers something. Let's call that the even bit coming in. This even bit triggers something. Let's call that the even bit coming in. This is the even bit and it's triggering something. And what it's triggering is a toggle in our output. So now we can begin drawing the state diagram. So we start off life right here. How are we going to describe it? Well, we're even. This caused us to go odd. And we're even and we're outputting zeros. Even and we're outputting a 0. So this is actually the output. This is a more diagram. And as long as we're receiving zeros, we're going to stay here. So this is an input. This is an output. 0, zeros. Now, once we get a 1, we're going to go to an odd place. So we're at this odd place and we're still outputting a 0. And we're going to stay in this odd place if we keep receiving zeros. Now we can't see that in here, but let's just assume we're going to stay in this odd place as long as we receive zeros. It's the ones that trigger something happening. Now this 1 triggers us to go back to even. But now we're going to begin outputting a 1. So this 1 triggers us to go back to an even place, but now we're outputting a 1. And this diagonal is caused by us waiting for a clock tick for this switch to even to occur. So now we're going to stay here at even as long as there's a 0, and we're going to wait for an odd to occur. Now when an odd occurs, we're going to move to another state, but we still keep outputting a 1. So we have another state right here that's odd, where we're still outputting a 1, and it's a 1 that causes us to move here. We're going to wait here at this odd state, keep putting out a 1 until we get to an even, and then we're going to switch back to outputting a 0. All right, so we're going around in a circle. Probably when we're right here, we're going to stay here until, we get this 1. All right, so let's check. 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so the next step is to draw the state table. Well, that's going to be pretty easy. Let's see, we have A, B, C, and D. We have just one input. It could be a value of 0 or 1. We're going to stay at A if it's a 0, stay at B if it's a 0, stay at C if it's a 0, stay at D if it's a 0. And if it's a 1, we're going to go to B. And for B we get a 1, we go to C. And for C we get a 1, we go to D. And for D we get a 1, we go to A. And then our output is going to be 0, 0, 1, 1. Let's check. Yep, stay home, move in a circle, 0, 0, 1, 1.